1990. The night was drowning in rain, the kind that doesn't cleanse but buries. Inside the Saint-Lazare private hospital, the corridors gleamed with sterile lights. But nothing could sterilize the dread clinging to my breath. I was 25, working the night shift as a junior nurse, still learning how to carry both the weight of life and the silence of death. Too new to fear properly, too proud to admit I was drowning. My hands trembled as I cradled the newborn, wrapped in a blanket too white for that hour. A faint cry escaped her lips, just as a thread of blood trickled down from a purple bruise on her forehead, soaking into the cotton pressed against my chest. I looked down, and in that moment, the scream I held inside my lungs was heavier than the weight of the infant in my arms. I stumbled into the corner of the nurse's station, my heart pounding louder than the monitors behind me, trying to hush the evidence of my trembling. The hallway outside was deserted, except for one figure who never wore white, but seemed carved from shadow. Marie, the kitchen maid with eyes like burnt coal and a silence that always arrived before her footsteps. She had just given birth, alone, in a forgotten room without windows, to a child too early, too fragile, too near the line that separates breath from memory. Marie did not speak immediately. She stood there for what felt like hours, watching me with a gaze that neither accused nor forgave. Her hands were dry and still, clasped as though gripping something invisible. Her voice, when it came, did not offer a plan, but rather dropped suggestions like stones into a black lake. "She won't survive this," she whispered, not about me, not about herself, but about the child in her own trembling arms. But she, her eyes tilted toward the bruised infant, she will. It wasn't a proposal. It was inevitability, wrapped in dread. My knees weakened, not from suggestion, but from the clarity with which the thought settled into me. One child will live, one will not, and in that frozen corridor of steel and antiseptic, decisions were not made, they simply happened. The exchange was quiet, rehearsed not in real time but in 1,000 desperate inner monologues. Marie handed over her daughter, barely breathing, her chest rising like paper under soft wind. My hands moved, numb and automatic, as I took the bundle. Then, with arms that no longer felt like mine, I slid the Moreau infant into Marie's apron. There was no scream to break the air, no question hanging in the silence, only a stillness so deep it could drown the moon. In the record books, Amélie Moreau was born healthy, destined for privilege and lineage. Léa Fournier, unnamed in any announcement, was placed in the ward with other fragile infants, expected not to last the week. Yet as I sat alone hours later, the blood on my uniform drying into a confession no one would read, I understood what had been done. The rain didn't stop falling that night, and I didn't go home. I stayed in the break room until dawn, watching the clock hand twitch toward morning, my mind folding around a truth I could never unwrap. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse was singing to a baby that wasn't hers, while in another cradle. Silence had already begun its vigil. I never told anyone what happened, but that night, under the echo of thunder, I learned what it meant to carry a choice so heavy it could fracture the spine of memory, and I carried it. Not for a year, not for a season, but for 25 years of silence, guilt, and the weight of a name that never truly belonged to her. Years passed, but the night never left me. It lingered not as a memory, but as a presence, quiet, constant, like the hum of a refrigerator that only disappears when the power goes out. I moved to the outskirts of Dijon, a town where no one asked questions, where the wind sounded different, as if it had forgotten how to speak of blood and names. I rented a small flat above a bakery, and each morning, the scent of burnt crust reminded me of how flesh once felt in my hands, warm, slippery, and full of unearned consequence. There were days when I did not think of her, but those were rare, and they never lasted long enough to matter. More often, I found myself staring at the newsstand on the corner, pretending not to notice the magazines that lined the windows. Still, when her face appeared, young, perfect, untouched by doubt, I couldn't look away, no matter how I tried. Amélie Moreau, daughter of the prestigious Moreau estate, heiress to champagne fields and a name polished by old money, stood in one photo beside a vineyard in bloom, the kind of green that stings the eyes. In another, she graced a fashion event, her posture carved like a sculpture, her eyes too still to be alive. My hand trembled once, and a bottle of wine I had meant to put away slipped and crashed against the counter, the red staining the wood grain like a wound reopening itself on cue, sometimes in the late hours when the world shrinks. I drew her in my journal, not as she looked in magazines, but how I imagined she might appear if she knew, not angry, not broken, but quietly aware, as though something inside her had turned to look backward. I could never tell whether I hoped she'd find me or feared it, and I wasn't sure which would hurt more if it came to pass. They say children carry echoes of their origins, even when deeply buried beneath the lives they live. Léa Fournier, the girl Marie raised, lived in Paris, not far from where Amélie posed for the cameras. She painted, and I saw her work once, strung along a park fence, modestly priced, fiercely alive. One painting held me in place, a woman's face, half-shadowed, undefined, yet familiar in the ache it summoned. I stood there for what felt like hours, unmoving beneath a sky too bright for secrets. I don't know if she saw me. Maybe she felt something, or maybe the moment passed through her, as soft as breath. Marc Moreau, Amélie's older brother, had grown into a man who did not trust silence, who searched it for fractures. He kept a scarf from his mother folded in a drawer, touched it sometimes, not out of sentiment, but suspicion. I was never there to see it, but I imagined him late at night, holding that faded fabric like a question, asking the dark if blood ever knows its own. I lived in shadow, but I saw everything. Through headlines, through brushstrokes, through the way people glance away when the truth gets too close. 25 years passed, but the memory didn't age. It simply shifted form, moving from marrow to skin, from secret to shadow. I never stopped watching. And in that watching, I began to understand. The past does not disappear. It waits, and waits, and sometimes it paints its way back into the world, one face at a time. I never believed in punishment, not in the way others did, with thunderbolts, bad luck, or retribution. But sometimes, I wondered if the universe didn't return what we tried to bury, not as revenge, but as a reminder that nothing stays hidden forever. When I read that Philippe Moreau, patriarch of the Moreau estate, had collapsed during a business conference and been rushed to the hospital, I felt the chill not of surprise, but of prophecy finally arriving. They said it was a rare blood disorder, aggressive, urgent, requiring a bone marrow transplant. And yet, no one in the family matched, not even his children. Celeste stood in the sterile consultation room, elegant in grief, her lips pressed into certainty as she whispered to the doctor, "I know she is my daughter, but why does her blood not say so?" Her voice was controlled, but her hands, trembling beneath her gloves, betrayed a fear she had never named. That single question, why, echoed through the hallways of her mind, not as doubt, but as something colder, possibility, the kind that does not knock, but lingers. Marc Moreau, always sharper than the rest, watched that scene with eyes too still for comfort. He had always carried a kind of tension, like a violin string tuned too tight, waiting to snap not from a scream, but from silence prolonged. That night, in his room, the file in one hand, the family photo in the other, the scarf still in his drawer folded precisely, Every thread whispered a name he didn't yet dare say aloud. The look in his eyes wasn't grief, it was suspicion, rising slow and steady like fog crawling through the vineyard soil when he saw Leah at the street market in Montmartre, beneath a tattered canvas tent scattered with paintings. His gaze was not casual, nor was his step accidental. He noticed her first through a window pane, her reflection bending in the glass, a face at once unknown and entirely too familiar. Something in the tilt of her head, the way she held the brush like it was speaking for her, struck him not by surprise but by certainty, the kind of certainty that does not emerge, but returns. He approached her not with accusation, but with curiosity polished into charm. They spoke briefly of art, of color, of blood, though neither understood the full weight of their words. He mentioned a campaign for voluntary marrow donors, a plea wrapped in grace and necessity. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing with a quiet, practiced caution, shaped by years of being slightly out of place. She declined, gently. But then he showed her a photograph of Philippe, pale and breathless in a hospital bed, not dying, but dissolving. It wasn't pity that moved her. It was instinct, that flicker of recognition in her marrow that said, "This matters." And so she said yes, somewhere. Across a hospital hallway humming with fluorescents and footfalls, a nurse entered a code into a system, unaware she had just opened the first door to a truth that had slept undisturbed for 25 years, the kind of truth that waits like rot under floorboards, silent, patient, irreversible. She sat still as the blood flowed, sleeve rolled up, veins exposed, her heart beat with a rhythm she did not recognize. And yet, it felt known. There was no fear, only a strange warmth in her chest, as though something within her had awakened, not a thought, but a memory passed down without words, carried only in cells and silence. That night, I walked the length of my apartment, touching walls I had memorized, feeling time bend inwards. I knew what was coming, not in the specifics, not in the science, but in the way an old scar tingles before the storm. Some truths do not expire, they ferment, and when they rise, they do not ask permission, they arrive with the taste of inevitability and the silence of something once buried that now breathes again. And when they rise, they do not ask permission, they arrive with the taste of inevitability and the silence of something once buried that now breathes again. The envelope arrived without ceremony, its edges crisp, the seal unbroken, as if it had not been handled by hands trembling with consequence. Mark opened it alone, in his study, beneath a lamp whose light barely reached the corners of the room. The document was short, no more than a page, and yet it carried the weight of an avalanche pressed into paper. He read the numbers once, then again, each repetition anchoring the inevitable, refusing to change what had already carved itself into the fabric of truth. The results did not waver. Leah Fournier, full match, complete, unbroken, unmistakable. There was no sound, but the room shifted, heavy with the breath of something ancient returning to claim its place. The air thickened. The silence crept up the walls like mold. Mark's hands did not shake, but his breath shortened, as though his lungs instinctively knew that some truths, when confirmed, do not cleanse, they calcify. He placed the report down slowly, as if even that act could shatter something fragile. For a long time, he sat unmoving, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he finally did. The suspicion was no longer a shadow, it had a name, a weight, and now it had marrow. Celeste found the report 2 hours later. She had come to speak to her son about hospital logistics, but instead found the envelope half open on the mahogany desk. She read it standing, her posture still immaculate, but her grip on the page tightened with each line. When she reached the final row, Leah Fournier, HLA match, 100%, her lips parted. not in exclamation, but in refusal. She exhaled slowly, her voice little more than air. No, this is not possible. She walked away from the room without closing the door behind her, as though leaving it open could drain the truth into the hallway. In the corridor, she pressed the paper to her chest, as though proximity could undo its meaning. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like metronomes counting down a life she no longer recognized. She did not weep, because her tears would have felt like agreement, like surrender, and she was not ready to concede. Mark did not follow her. He remained where he was, staring not at the report, but at the painting above the fireplace, a landscape of the Moreau vineyard, sunlit and eternal. But today, the vineyard looked cold, distant, like land viewed through glass, intact, yet unreachable, as if it no longer belonged to him, or he to it, elsewhere. Leah received a call. The voice on the other end was clinical, warm only in structure, informing her of the compatibility with the patient. Her reaction was stillness. No relief, no confusion, only a breath drawn and held too long, suspended in a space where recognition had not yet become meaning. She thanked them with a voice even she barely recognized, then hung up slowly and sat down on the floor of her apartment, her back against the wall, her hand still holding the receiver like an anchor in a room that had just begun to shift. The city outside continued, as cities do, unaware of the seismic shift occurring inside a single room where a name had just redrawn the map of blood. Leah remained seated, her presence a punctuation mark between two lives. Minutes passed like shadows stretching across her floor. Eventually, she stood, walked to her canvas, and picked up a brush, not to paint, but to feel weight, to hold form, to anchor herself within something that, if not truth, was at least real. Meanwhile, Felipe was still in the hospital, unaware that beneath the machines sustaining him, a deeper operation had already begun, the unraveling of a lie so old, it had been mistaken for truth. Nurses passed by his door, unaware that a name on a file had just rewritten a family's bloodline and rearranged the meaning of belonging. And I watched it unfold in silence, not as a voyeur, but as a relic of the night where it all began. I knew what they would feel before they named it, because I had lived inside that knowing for decades. The match was not the revelation, it was the permission. The door left ajar, the moment when doubt became undeniable. Permission to question everything. The truth had arrived, not with thunder, not with violence, but as sunlight through glass, quiet, unstoppable, and impossible to unsee. There are moments when silence becomes too heavy to carry, when even a single step echoes like a scream across years of buried choices. In the days following the revelation, the Moreau estate did not shatter outward. It folded in on itself, like old paper catching fire from the inside. Marie, once invisible in the background of their grand estate, now found herself walking hallways that listened differently, as though the walls had begun whispering her name back to her, not in accusation, but in memory. Mark was not idle. With every answer he received, he carved deeper into the brittle surface of their family's story, unearthing documents, cross-referencing hospital logs, matching signatures that no longer made sense. His questions were not shouted, they were placed, like stones in a river, forcing the current to bend. The name Saint-Lazare returned more than once. And with it, the nurse records from that storm-soaked night. Patterns emerged, not as facts, but as rhythms, a heartbeat irregular enough to be fatal. Marie felt the shift everywhere, the glances, the hesitations, the small rearrangements of routine that revealed more than they concealed. One morning, she opened the tin box beneath her wardrobe and took out the infant bracelet, the one she had kept, not out of sentiment, but as proof of her guilt, her leverage, her survival. The letters on the tag were faded, but the weight of it remained unbearable, and her fingers lingered on it longer than they ever had before, as if heat had finally risen from metal that once felt inert. Elsewhere, my sleep grew thinner. I watched the way she gripped the table's edge during breakfast, how her hand paused mid-air each time the news mentioned the Moreau name. She had recorded a message for Marie once, a voice note, trembling and unfinished, that she never sent. I know, because I listened to it one night, long after she'd fallen asleep. Her words were soft, nearly gone. I cannot take this secret to my grave. I cannot hold it any longer, not when the past is knocking at our door. Mark came to her door, not with force, not with threat, but with the kind of stillness that leaves no room for retreat. He asked no questions at first, just stood on the threshold, holding nothing but the silence between them. I opened the door wider, and inside, she offered tea she never poured, her hands moving on memory. He asked about Saint-Lazare, and the air left her lungs in a way that was not breath, but release. Years of silence exhaled in one unspoken truth. She did not confess fully, but she gave him a name, a shift in timing, a window into what had always been slightly ajar. In that instant, Mark understood what had always evaded him, that truth does not arrive like thunder. It leaks in through quiet, unfinished sentences, through stares that last a fraction too long, through the name no one dares say. He left without pressing further, because the worst kind of lie is not the one told loudly, but the one held gently, as if cradling an infant too bruised to survive honesty. The trap had been set, but it had not yet closed. Pressure did not explode. It condensed into glances, hesitations, silences thick enough to choke. Every look, every question, every breath in the Moreau estate now carried weight, and in that weight, truth began to take shape, not as confession, but as inevitability. The unraveling had begun, not violently, but quietly, like fabric tearing where the seam was weakest, where history had been stitched too quickly. And some secrets, when cornered, do not vanish. They turn and they speak. Recovery does not arrive as a miracle, nor does it sweep in with the grandeur of redemption. It comes quietly, without fanfare, creeping in like a hesitant guest who takes the furthest seat at the table, unsure whether it has been truly invited. In the weeks after the truth surfaced, the Moreau estate did not return to peace. It adjusted, one breath at a time, as if relearning how to exist beneath a new sky where silence was no longer absence, but recalibration. Philippe, weak but breathing, moved through the corridors of his memory with a gait that carried both weariness and wonder. The transplant had been successful. His marrow now carried the blood of a stranger who was not a stranger at all, whose gift had rewritten not only his biology, but also the ledger of belonging. Leia came to see him in the hospital, not as a daughter demanding affection, but as a human offering time, presence, and the kind of silence that speaks more than comfort. He watched her with the stillness reserved for portraits, as though every glance was a brushstroke revealing something previously unseen. They did not speak of lineage or regret. They simply watched the light move across the room, sharing breath and space in quiet acknowledgement. In that sterile sanctuary, something unspoken began to grow, not yet forgiveness, but something gentler, a mutual willingness to coexist without resolution. Leia asked no questions, placed books by his bedside, and once left a sketch of an old man in a vineyard, drawn with lines so gentle yet unwavering that Philippe traced them with a finger, unsure if he was touching a portrait, a mirror, or a map of memory he had long misplaced. Elsewhere, moved like someone who had finally placed her burden down, not lighter, not freer, but no longer bent beneath the weight of a secret that had devoured decades. She stopped drinking, began waking with the dawn, and one morning made her way to a cemetery, not to mourn, but to leave a single white flower, unmarked, unnamed, offered not for absolution but as a symbol of surrender. She did not look back as she walked away, and I knew then the past had begun walking behind her, no longer ahead. Amélie vanished, not in body, for she still moved through rooms, answered to her name, and ate her meals, but in essence, retreating from reflections, from conversations, from the version of herself she no longer recognized in the mirror's silence. The photos came down slowly, one frame at a time, until her walls stood bare, stained faintly by memory's residue. I do not know what hollowed her more, the revelation itself, or the aching realization that her life had been built atop another's displacement. But pain, too, can be a doorway. And Amélie began to walk through hers, not with certainty, but with hands that needed to touch resistance. She found solace in sculpting. Something about the clay, its refusal to yield without effort, seemed to ground her in the present. Her first piece was small, abstract, and yet unmistakably feminine. She gave it no name, only space on her windowsill where the morning light could rest upon its edges. Mark remained a quiet axis around which everything had tilted. He spoke little, demanded less, and yet he anchored the shifting house like a lighthouse, constant, solemn, immune to the fog. He no longer searched for truth. He had found it. Now. He labored to build what could come after, not justice, not legacy, but connection. And in that quiet construction, there formed not a restored family, but an awakened one. Healing does not come in waves, nor in declarations. It comes in sips, in quiet glances, in the absence of blame. The name Moreau was still spoken, though more softly now, as if even pride had learned how to exhale. Some wounds do not close, but they cease to bleed, and that, quiet, slow, unwavering, is sometimes enough to begin again. There are words we carry like seeds, never planted, never spoken aloud, but always growing beneath the surface, twisting their roots into memory in the quiet days after the rupture, when the dust no longer danced but settled. Marie began to write, not to the court, nor the press, nor even to God, but to Leah. A letter never intended for the postal system, not meant for delivery, but crafted as an offering to silence, as an act of making peace with what she could never undo. She wrote on thick paper, yellowed at the edges, the kind that absorbs ink slowly, making each stroke feel like a confession pressed into time. Her handwriting was neither rushed nor ornate. It bore the rhythm of someone who knew the value of restraint. The first line came after hours of sitting. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that love, however broken, once existed. Marie told no one she was writing. Each morning, before the guards came with their measured footsteps and indifferent eyes, she sat by the window, letting the light fall over her knuckles and onto the page. She did not recount every event. She knew Leah remembered. Instead, she wrote of moments Leah never saw, how she whispered lullabies to a child who didn't respond, how she held her breath every time fever came, how she believed, in a place she never admitted, that the child had been meant for something more. There was no justification in her words, no plea for sympathy, just a recounting, soft and bare, like laying stones beside a river that had already chosen its path. She wrote of the night it happened, the hospital air sharp with chemicals, the cries too loud for one room, the silence too deep in another. And she wrote the sentence she had never spoken aloud. I chose to save a life, but in doing so, I rewrote too. Marie mentioned me once, not in blame, but with the kind of recognition that does not ask for reply. Marie wrote, she was afraid, more than I was, and maybe that is why I moved faster. It was the closest she came to apology, not because she lacked regret, but because sorrow had long replaced speech in her. She folded the letter when it was done, not in halves, but in thirds, as if folding it differently might change how it felt in her hands. She placed it inside an envelope without sealing it. The letter rested in her drawer beside a rosary she no longer touched, and the infant bracelet she could never throw away. That drawer became a chapel, silent, secret, sacred. Leah never received it, but perhaps she felt it, in the way her hand hovered longer over certain colors when she painted, in the way she once paused mid-brushstroke and whispered, "Not to anyone. I see now." I often think about how many letters remain unsent in this world, how many truths find no voice. Only wait. Marie's letter was not redemption. It was a mirror, a breath, a final act of grace by someone who knew that even in ruin, there are ways to lay things down without shattering them. Some truths are not meant to be spoken aloud. They are meant to be written and never sent. Memory does not knock. It seeps. It slips beneath doors, curls into the folds of curtains, lingers in the dust that dances where no footsteps fall. And in that house, once filled with secrets that pressed against the walls like mold beneath paint, there was now only air and time and the soft rustle of what had not been said. The Moreau estate, so often a monument to pride, now stood quiet, less like a fortress, more like a breath held too long, waiting to be exhaled. Celeste sat alone most mornings, not in grief, but in reckoning. At the long dining table, where champagne once sparked beneath crystal chandeliers, now sat two empty chairs. One set gently for Leah, the other left quietly for Amélie. She did not know which daughter would return, or if either would cross the threshold again, but she had stopped arranging the silverware, choosing instead to place her palms flat on the wood, as though waiting to feel a pulse through it, a beat, a signal, a memory rising from the grain of a past too polished. Amélie had moved out months earlier, choosing a quiet apartment above a modest bookshop in the 5th arrondissement. She rarely answered calls, though she read every letter with a stillness that felt like listening. Leah had sent one, not long, not elaborate, but folded into a watercolor sketch of two girls walking away from a vineyard, with steps soft enough to be remembered. Amélie pinned it to her wall, not in a frame, but as paper pressed to plaster, held up by a single piece of tape. It stayed because it spoke. They met sometimes, by chance, or something resembling it, not to reconcile, but to coexist without explanation. Once at a gallery, once beside the Seine, once in the quiet aisle of a grocery store just before midnight. They did not embrace. They did not explain. They looked at each other long enough to recognize the past, and then turned away before memory could speak too loudly, and that fragile stillness, somehow, was enough for now. Mark spent less time at the estate, allowing silence to replace answers he no longer sought. He traveled often, and always alone, with a journal in which he wrote only dates and places, no reflections, no commentary, just anchors for a soul unmoored but moving. When he returned, he brought gifts without purpose, an olive branch from Tuscany, a photo of windmills from northern Spain, a vial of salt from the Dead Sea. He gave them without occasion, without note. They were not offerings. They were weight. No one spoke of me anymore, and yet my absence had a shape, an outline in air, a pause in certain conversations. I left quietly, without farewell, leaving behind the scent of lavender oil on the last doorstep I swept. No forwarding address, no trail to follow, but I believe I found peace, not in departure, but in allowing the truth to stand on its own, no longer needing my trembling hands to shelter it. One afternoon, under a sky too wide to hold sorrow, Leah walked the vineyard rows alone, her footsteps gentle upon the softened soil, The sun was mild, the wind forgiving, and she paused at the place where the land dipped, where the grapes once grew wildest, their sweetness uncontained. She took a deep breath, not to taste the air, but to leave something in it, a name, a sigh, a memory folded into light. She no longer needed answers, because sometimes healing is not knowing, but accepting the silence where answers used to live. Some stories do not end, they exhale, and sometimes what remains is not the wound, but the wind that moves through it. There is a kind of silence that does not ask for stillness, but for consideration, the kind that settles only when the storm has spoken everything it needed to say. And those left behind must begin, somehow, to listen. That silence stretched between Celeste and the two chairs, still facing the same direction, still waiting. But this time, it was not waiting for apology, nor explanation, but for presence. I did not witness their first reunion, but I imagined how it might have unfolded, not with fanfare, not with forgiveness, but with the slow choreography of two women entering the same room, breathing the same air, and neither turning away. Amélie would have arrived first, not out of pride, but precision. She always measured arrival as carefully as she measured her words. Leia would have followed, not late, not rushed, but as if guided by something quieter than time. Their conversations were brief, sometimes only a glance across a shared space, a pause between sentences, a nod that didn't mean agreement but understanding. There was no need to redefine who was daughter and who was sister. They simply began to exist in parallel, not overlapping, but never fully parting again. Beneath the labels, there was something older than naming, a shared knowing, a symmetry in the fracture. Celeste observed this with the careful distance of someone who had once tried to control the narrative but had learned, painfully, to surrender it. She no longer dictated dinners nor determined expectations. She simply remained, arranging flowers with no special occasion, refilling the fruit bowl whether it would be touched or not. Her greatest gesture, perhaps, was to stay visible without speaking, to be available without demand. One morning, I watched her place a photo on the mantel, not an old portrait, not a family heirloom, but a new image, taken in passing, in it. Amélie and Leia stood on opposite ends of a vineyard path, both unaware of the camera, both mid-step, both facing forward. She didn't frame it, just rested it against the clock. She told no one. But that was how I knew she had begun to see them both again, not as mistake and replacement, but as truth and truth, side by side. Mark remained the quiet hinge of this slow reconciliation. He never spoke of what he had uncovered. He never reminded anyone of the fracture. He simply brought chairs for every gathering, formal or impromptu. He ensured there were enough seats, even if some remained empty. And somehow, that act alone held the promise of welcome. As for me, I never returned, but I remained in the folds, a name sometimes avoided, sometimes forgiven, but always remembered. Letters arrived at an old post office box, though I never opened them. I preferred to imagine their contents, updates without pressure, stories without expectation, kindness without obligation. Perhaps that is what family becomes, when everything else has been tested. Not duty, but choice. We do not choose our beginnings, but we are offered a say in how we continue, and sometimes what remains is not lineage, nor law, but the space we allow each other to occupy, without explanation, without condition. Family is not the blood that binds. It is the silence that holds without letting go. The future does not arrive like a promise. It enters quietly, stepping across thresholds laid by choices too small to be seen until they shape everything. And in the stillness after truth, what remains is not always clarity, but a space where clarity can begin to grow. That space became the soil where Leia stood, between inheritance and instinct, between the weight of a name and the gravity of freedom. She was offered the vineyard not only as land, but as legacy, a name engraved on casks, on contracts, and on expectations too old to question. Yet when she walked its rows, it was not with ownership, but with listening shaped by memory. The vines did not ask to be possessed. They asked to be understood in a language older than lineage, and perhaps that was why. One morning, she stood at the border of the northern slope and simply said, aloud to no one, that it was not yet time. It was not refusal, but pause, a decision to consider not what she owed, but what she could become if she followed something quieter than tradition. She moved to the edge of the village instead, opening a studio where vines still entered her paintings, but this time, not as inheritance, but as rhythm. She did not deny the Moreau name, nor did she carry it with pride. She let it rest, like soil left untouched to heal before new planting. Amelie, too, shifted, not with defiance, but with slow disassembly of the roles once assigned to her, like inherited garments. No longer the centerpiece of a family myth, she began to unravel the scripts written into her posture, her tone, and her days, in time. She started teaching literature at a local lycée, where her voice no longer needed to be flawless, only honest in its offering. Her students did not know her story, but they listened when she spoke of narratives that carry more questions than answers. And sometimes, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, she would find herself smiling at the thought that even stories long burdened with expectation could still be reclaimed. Celeste aged more gently than anyone had expected, her face no longer a mask of duty, but a map softened by time that no longer demanded perfection. She no longer asked about legacy, nor did she speak often of names. Instead, her words turned toward seasons, harvests, and the small rituals that outlast grief. In the kitchen, she began leaving the windows open, letting the wind touch the old curtains as if the house itself had begun to breathe differently, carrying not ghosts, but air. Mark remained steady, not as a reminder of the past, but as a quiet architecture of presence. He did not retell what had been unearthed, nor did he seek to redefine anyone's place within what remained. Instead, he made room, sometimes through silence, sometimes through gestures as simple as setting one extra place at the table. He once told Leia, over a glass of wine left half finished, that survival is not about correcting the past, but about choosing what we carry forward. She said nothing in reply. But the next day, a small canvas appeared in his room, brushstrokes in burgundy and green, deep and knotted like roots refusing to forget. And I watched from afar, not with longing and not with regret, but with a softness that only time can offer to those who have once stood too close to fire. I did not need to return, nor be remembered kindly. I only needed to know that no one was still pretending, and that, at last, every truth had been named aloud, not as victory, but as truth. The vineyard remained, the sun still fell on the hills, and the grapes still ripened without permission, without legacy's approval. But beneath that light, something new had begun, not a dynasty, not a monument, but a rhythm steady enough to carry forward. We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to make of it. And when truth becomes breath, and breath becomes choice, that is when a family is no longer bound, but born again.